Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Transformation Digital Art, Lima's yearly symposium. And welcome also in our online platform. Feel free to browse around after, maybe slightly during this live stream. If you don't manage to find your way, day 2 of Transformation Digital Art, Lima's yearly symposium. And welcome also in our online platform. Feel free to browse around after, maybe slightly during this live stream. Yeah, so as I said, feel free to explore the platform. If you don't manage to find your way, there's an introductory video, and there's more content than this stream that we're currently having, but don't feel rushed. There's time to explore this in the week after the festival or the symposium. So you can come back to it with the logins that you currently have. So now let's focus on this afternoon's program, in which we will reflect about collective knowledge building and sharing, and the access and distribution to it. We will do so in the form of a keynote lecture by artist, researcher, and artistic archivist Cornelia Sollfrank, followed by a panel discussion that includes Elizabeth Stainforth, a lecturer in heritage studies at the University of Leeds, Lozana Rossenova, a digital designer and a researcher based in Berlin, who recently completed a PhD degree in collaboration with Rhizome, and Giselle Beiguelman, an artist and professor at the School of Architecture and Urbanism at the University of Sao Paulo. Topics that I think will be touched upon in the upcoming hours will be ways of taking care of often vulnerable digital cultural memory and heritage, and the access to it in both technological and socio-economical and or political ways. So what is it, this digital heritage that we want to take care of, and what are the infrastructures at hand, and who is represented and who is able to use them? I'm sure we will also touch upon the pros and cons of both centralized and decentralized ways of building and sharing knowledge, and the platforms to do so. But I don't want to speak out of turn, so I think it's time to welcome our moderator of this afternoon's session, Geert Lovink. Geert is a Dutch media theorist, an internet critic, and an author who founded the Institute of Network Cultures in 2004. You probably know this institute from one of the many conferences, publications, and research networks that it has organized, such as Video Vortex and Money Lab. In December 2021, Geert was appointed Professor of Art and Network Cultures at the UvA Art History Department. Without further ado, I want to give the word and the floor and the screen to Geert Lovink. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sanneke. Welcome, everybody. Day 2. It is March 18, more than 3 weeks into the war in Ukraine. We are going to discuss matters of digital politics and archives. I have to mention this because, it's very much on my mind. And at least here in Europe, this is really a defining moment, also in terms of internet politics and the architectures of the networks. Okay, today is dedicated to distributed knowledge, and I'll read the text here that Lima has written. The participatory, open, and decentralized potentials of digital systems continue to animate artistic and cultural practices, as well as corporate and governmental agendas they unfold among. What practices sustain these post-digital assemblages and allow them to evolve? What are the politics embedded in their designs and protocols? How is the knowledge nourished within them, opened up to both human and algorithmic reuse? This session is dedicated to a critical reflection on the collaborative practices and network topologies through which artists, institutions, and communities produce knowledge. Okay. And we're going to start, as Sanneke already said, with a keynote by Cornelia Sollfrank. Hello, Cornelia. How are you?
Hi, Geert. Thanks a lot.
Yes. Okay, good. Cornelia is in Berlin, living and working there from what I can read here, digital cultures and artistic infrastructures, new forms of political self-organization, critical authorship, aesthetics of the commons, and techno-feminist practices and theory. As a pioneer of internet art, Cornelia built up a reputation with two central projects, the Net Art Generator, a web-based art producing machine, and Female Extension, her famous hack of the first competition of internet art. Okay, Cornelia, the floor is yours, and we are going to discuss matters with you later, and we'll have a lot of time at the very end to go deep into the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Geert. And before I start, I would like to thank Gabi Weijers for their invitation, and Maya Yusila for preparing the event, and all the other staff at Lima who helped to make it possible. Gabi asked me to contribute some of my practice experiences as an artist, and artistic researcher is something I consider myself to be only temporarily at the moment. To contribute some of my experiences and reflections on the process of archiving collective projects, as well as doing this work of caretaking in a collective setting. There are a number of projects that could be relevant in this context, and my suggestion for today is to introduce three of them. I will start with the recent publication. So I think I have it here. Fix My Code is an ebook that I co-authored with Winnie Soon. It's about the classic of net art that has been mentioned already, the Net Art Generator. Then I continue with a research project that we did at Zurich University of the Arts titled Creating Commons. And I will end with an archiving project we are about to finish in the next weeks. It's the OBN archive, the archive of the Old Boys Network. These projects are very different. The first one is a dialogical reflection on a net-based art project, which has been online and functional for more than 20 years. The second is a research project that explored and documented artist-run digital commons projects. And the last one is a cyber-feminist network, a historical formation that was active between 1997 and 2001. And of course, they can all be situated in the larger framework of media art. All these works, all these works are breaking ground in their time, but what they also have in common is they take place in cultural niches. They are works that don't have an author, that cannot be owned and collected, that have an expiry date built in. So how can we think about the recognition and preservation of such practices, which implies much more than material aspects? How can we conceive of and negotiate a caring together that involves actors from different fields and avoids the traps of reproductive labor? And before I take a closer look at the individual projects, I would like to make a little excursion into a concept that binds all of them together, the concept of care. The term care has become widespread in the arts and academia in recent years, and it's used in a variety of contexts to refer to moral attitudes or particular practices or forms of labor. Imported from political theory and philosophy, it has also long played an important role in feminism, in particular in relation to unpaid reproductive labor, but it also increasingly used in a broader understanding of care for the environment or care for health. As Tronto and Fischer put it, care means everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. This very general definition of care shall be the guiding for my reflections on the topic because it contains one of the most important aspects of the care discussions of recent years, the feminist idea of the politics of interdependence, which assumes not only a fundamental connectedness, but also a mutual dependence. And it concedes agency from the outset because it speaks of doing something or even having to do something. Because care is not least also a material practice, traditionally understood as maintenance or concrete work. Ethical and affective aspects pervade the various levels of care, ranging from a passive caring about to an active taking care of and giving care as an intervention or alleviation of need. And the notion of caring with was later added by Tronto, expressing the idea of doing the caring work not alone, but together with others. Also, the various degrees of involvement describe different processes. The individual phases are interwoven and allow us to think across subjectivity, relationality, organization, and materiality. So that was a little introduction. Oh, I would also like, maybe this is a perfect bridge to the first project, the ebook Fix My Code. It's a self-quote, basically. Caring means worrying, being ready to take responsibility, being on the outlook for new types of relation, of building new forms of knowledge. Knowledge that is interested not only in observation and representation, but also in transformation, involving relations with things, in being affected, and thus in changing itself and the world in a process of code transformation. So this is a quote from the book that I'm going to introduce to you a little bit closer now, Fix My Code. As I said in the beginning, this book is a dialogical reflection on a net-based art project, the Net Art Generator. And for those of you who are not familiar with the project, which is meanwhile a classic of net art, it is a computer program that interactively collects and recombines material from the internet to create collages. It can be accessed via a browser and requires the user to enter a title, which then functions as a search term, and to enter a name, which takes on the function of an author. A server-based image processing tool recombines the material, including a number of chance operations. The resulting images are stored online in an archive from where recent results can be downloaded. The project went online in 1998, so 24 years ago. And since then, in different versions, has tirelessly generated collages of texts, websites, and images. But in parallel, it has also generated a number of discourses, most notable in the context of authorship, copyright, and open source, which is why the piece has also been conceptualized as a conceptual tool or a thinking tool. And here in the background, you see some of the images and the discourses that it has produced. It was particularly the anonymous Warhol flowers that have caused me to look deeper into copyright issues, because I could not exhibit these flowers for a long time because of alleged copyright infringement. So I went down this alley to explore the relationship between authorship, originality, and copyright. I don't go deeper into that, but that gives you a little bit of an idea, so that we have this tool at the one hand, which is quite simple, straightforward, It functions very stable, everyone can use it, and it's being used on a daily basis by at least 100 visitors. So, but at the same time, apart from being this simple tool, it has generated a lot of discourses, as I mentioned. So the dialogue between Winnie Soon and myself started in 2015 when I had a fellowship at Aarhus University, where she at the time did her PhD and where she now works as a professor. Her PhD was on software art practice, and she made an interview with me for her research. Winnie has a strong background in technology and now mainly works as an artist and a researcher. Her main field of interest is software, which she explores as both a technologist and as an artist, considering technopolitical as well as aesthetic frameworks for her practice. We both identify as artists and researchers, but we belong to different generations. She's much younger than I am. We have very different cultural backgrounds. So she was brought up in Hong Kong, China, and a different skill set. We also have very different skill set, which inspired us to keep the dialogue going. Our dialogue includes all kinds of topics ranging from code as material, which is more her expertise, art theory, which is more my expertise, affective and other infrastructures, the need for collaboration, the productive side of dysfunctionality, and gender aspects of technopolitics. So this whole sphere, or this whole field of cyberfeminism, technofeminism, is something she was only confronted with through me. And so we come from very different sides, and we engaged in a very nice, interesting dialogue, which is still going on. So when the NetArt generator broke shortly after our first meeting, the dialogue turned into a collaboration. In order to produce collages, the NAC depends on a search engine to find the relevant material. After Google had changed its policy, the search results were no longer freely available through the API. One had to register, get an ID and a key, and would be charged if the use exceeds 100 requests per day. This dependency on a search engine has been a breaking point throughout the project's existence, and once more we had to find a way how to deal with it. It took us several months to explore all the options and implications, and we decided to stay with the free version and a limited number of requests, and make it transparent on the website when Google cut off access. So here you can see if 100 requests have been made, this error message comes up. We tell the users what's going on. It's not the program that broke, but it's a limitation that came from Google. And we also thought it would be nice to indicate that we are in the long run trying to teach Google about what they can do to support internet art in a meaningful way, but it doesn't seem like that they are interested in this kind of art at the moment. So that is one first project, which is this dialogue, and I think we can talk about this later also in the discussion. It is a form of knowledge production between two people with very different backgrounds, but we have a common interest, and all our dialogues evolve around this one project. And it's surprising how we go from one level to the next. And the very current discourse we are involved in with the NetArt generator is this whole debate and practice on NFTs, but that is something else, not for today. Yeah. So Winnie helped me to fix my code, which also gave the title to the book. And before that to decide on what solution would be the best. But our collaboration expanded beyond solving technical problems to a discussion about broader cultural and techno-political issues. The process of troubleshooting, discussing, decision-making, and amending that followed produced a new discourse, which the two of us decided to be another episode in the narrative of the net art generator and to serve as the basis for this publication. So we have this editor in Berlin called Eclectic. They are specializing in ebooks and visual culture. And the owner of this publishing house, she witnessed one of our discussions and she suggested to us to make this book, which we very much appreciated. So the image you can see here now is a custom-made web server sculpture. We call it the NUC machine. It's a kind of a sculpture. It's definitely an object. And ZKM got it for their collection. On this server, the software is running, the net art generator software is running. And when, of course, it broke on our server, it also broke on their server, but it was not connected at the time, so they didn't even realize. And after we had fixed the code on our side, we approached ZKM and they said they were very enthusiastic because they said they just brought out this sculpture from the storage because it was supposed to go into an exhibition and they realized it wouldn't work. So they invited us over to collaborate with them. And we even did a workshop there with conservators on media art. And it was a quite interesting, I think, mutual, fruitful collaboration because we could tell them about the process of fixing code and of course, but they could also provide their resources. And this is probably already one example of this distributed knowledge production and the networks of care. And when we have finished our books, when we had finished the book, they invited us back to present it and tell about the process. So it's, I think it's embedded in a larger discourse between academics and myself as a freelance artist and the institution. So that was the first example. Here is an image of the setup at the ZKM. So the second project I would like to talk about briefly, so I can only briefly touch upon that, but for me the most important thing is kind of to show a little bit the variety of projects and the specificities they have in relation to our today's topic of discussion. So the second project is called Creating Commons, and that was a research project we conducted at the Zurich University of the Arts between 2017 and 2020. The team consisted of Felix Stalder, Shusha Niederberger, and myself. And the main idea of this project was to work with the concept of the commons and apply it to the art field where classical paradigms such as authorship related to its copyright, but also originality and individual creativity suggest a sphere that has nothing or not much to do with social relations and political power structures. In order to define a delimited field for our research, we decided to put a focus on digitally networked practices, not because we want to suggest some separate digital reality, but rather because the material conditions of the digital environment generate dynamics that are definitely different from physical objects. So the next step, we selected a number of projects we wanted to explore as exemplary in terms of bringing together aesthetic practices with properties of the commons. Working with the concept of the commons necessarily comes with certain a vagueness, because there are many meanings and interpretations floating around. And in fact, we thought that it's exactly this imprecision that can provide the space for speculation and experimentation. At the same time, we found that the structural definition suggested by Massimo De Angelis and Stavros Stavridis provides a useful framework within which to investigate the selected projects. In their text on the Commons from 2011, they elaborate the following three-part definition. So in order to constitute a commons, there needs to be first a pool of resources that can be any kind of resources, goods, tangible or intangible, rival or non-rival goods. Secondly, a community of people who create and sustain these resources, the so-called commoners. And thirdly, a social process that creates and reproduces the commons. That means people taking things into their own hands, negotiating, creating the rules for which also the verb to common or commoning has been suggested. Commoning has been described as the social practice of constant negotiation of the terms and conditions for the use of the respective resources. So this definition allows to distinguish between goods, people, and social relations, and to understand them at the same time as integral parts of the commons as a social institution. And of course, these distinctions do not apply to all commons equally, but the advantage of this three-part definition is that it provides various entry points into a research field in which economic, political, philosophical, and social issues overlap in a complex way. And in our research area, of course, additionally, aesthetic considerations come into play. Without theoretically determining what constitutes commons, this structural definition provides or provided for us the framework that left space for specific approaches from various disciplines. And it particularly also encouraged the study of existing project and thus the alignment of theory and practice. And this is exactly what we did in this research project. So we selected 15 projects, and they all, what they have in common, they all theorize and practice free resources, such as digital archives or technical infrastructures, local spaces or educational institutions or tools. And what unites them, however, is that they all have a double character in our understanding. They are art in the sense that they place themselves in relation to Western cultural and art systems, developing discursive and aesthetic positions, but at the same time, they are operational in that they create recursive environments and freely available resources whose uses exceed the art system. The first aspect raises questions about the kind of aesthetics that are being embodied, and the second creates a relation to the larger concept of the commons. And so I already brought up the first example. We had one category containing mainly so-called pirate archives or pirate collections. One example here is Monoscope. I think it's quite well known in Amsterdam and in many other places. It's run by Dujan Barak, who initiated it, and I also put in some links, because with all of the artists we involved, we made lengthy video interviews that are still available. His, for example, From Notepad to Cultural Resource, the aesthetics of cross-linking at Monoscopes, where he very nicely describes how the project really started from his personal need, working as a young artist in Slovakia, trying to have more, first of all, not only having access to and information about similar-minded artists, but also kind of making or mapping what is in his direct environment, and from there building it, making it larger, building larger networks. And I don't have current numbers here, but if you take a look at monoscope.org, you will be surprised what you find there and how largely it is networked. So that is just one of the examples. The other is Memory of the World. That also originates in Croatia with the project Public Library and several sub-libraries. What is very different, I mean, I don't go into all of these projects. They have a lot in common, but they are also kind of very big differences. So we had the opportunity to explore them and see what different examples or practices artists come up with. So I mentioned another one is ARC, arc.fail it's called at the moment. It constantly has to change its URL because it's being taken down. ARC is a resource for academic text or text in the field of art theory, architecture, philosophy, and so on. And I have given talks about these projects in different parts of the world, and for us it's maybe a nice add-on and feature to have probably many books we already own also available digitally if we need them. But for many people in different parts of the world who don't have access at all, for them these artists organized and run platforms, which are all illegal, I have to say, are sometimes the only resource they have to access certain literature. So ARC was another example of the pirate. Then we have OXDB. It's a bit different because they only have videos. They're specialized in film, and it's a very interesting technically platform. It's not so much about downloading film, but it includes in the platform a lot of technical features which allows to compare research and so on about the stock of films they have. And do we have another one? No. So, oh yeah, we have Ubu, of course, which is probably also quite famous in a different scene. It's run by Kenneth Goldsmith, New York-based artist. It's more like a private collection that evolved around his personal interests, but he built it over the course of also more than 20 years. It also started in 97, and it grew into a vast archive, which provides what he calls avant-garde of the 20th century. But well, yes, it's worth exploring, especially for people who are teaching and need access to material. You can find a lot there which you cannot find anywhere else, which is interesting. And here again, the point is Kenneth completely ignores copyright, so he can provide access to everything. There's even one video of myself on Ubu which I cannot publish anywhere else because I don't have the copyright, or I had copyright issues. That was my interview with Andy Warhol. So he was the only one who put it up, and I don't have to worry about copyright issues. It's all his business. But they are all together really great resources which provide access to very different material. And we had several research meetings also with them. And it's so interesting because they take on, I mean, they build these massive infrastructures. They take on so much responsibility, and it's all basically on private initiatives, very small groups. And it's not so much the material costs that come with it, but it's the risk they're taking on in terms of copyright. They regularly have problems with that. But also, I think what they all really suffer from is the huge responsibility they have after a certain time to keep up and to keep working these platforms, because they cannot just, I mean, they could say, we just stop it, but of course they don't want to. They are really important infrastructures. So it was interesting to talk about this, and I think that there are all issues that that are also interesting to discuss with institutions, because they very often envy, the work these people can do, because they can ignore copyright, which public institutions, of course, can't. So it's also no options to say that the public institutions, for example, take over these collections and so on and so forth. So, but it's very interesting to think about how we can maintain and support this, and that was all part of our research project. So it was, I have a few more. So these were mainly the pirate archives. As you see, I could talk quite a lot about that, but I'll stop it here. Just to give a few other examples, it was not only the archives, but we are also interested in, artists run, how do you call it, communities, platforms, spaces. One of them very outstanding is Furtherfield in London, that kind of emerged at the same time, also late 90s. They say of themselves, they connect people, ideas, critical thinking, imaginative possibilities through artworks, labs, debate, people from all walks, life explore today's important questions. And what they mainly do is, and what their agenda was from the beginning on, was to drive an art discourse, when the art world was mainly busy with young British artists, to have an eye on digital development, to understand, to kind of to practice a critical approach to technology and explore digital technologies for artists and other purposes. And it took them quite a long time, and they had, I think in the beginning, very hard time to get funding. Meanwhile, they are quite, I think, established, one could say. They get some funding and they have built a huge network. But it's again this responsibility that comes with it, and how you can distribute this kind of projects to involve other people. So here is the two people who run it. We also did a long interview with them. This is the place in the park. It's very accessible in North London. Shortly, I want to mention another. As I said, we have 15 projects, but this is just a few examples so that you can get an idea of what interested us. The last one is Miss Balthasar's laboratory. It's based in Vienna. It's a techno-feminist lab that does exhibitions, runs workshops, has a community. It's all about knowledge transfer on gender critical background. So also interviews with these people. So I leave that there because otherwise it would be too long. But at the end of our research project, we tried to bring together a little bit these different ideas and insights we had, and we invited 10 theoreticians to reflect on the projects and their potential from their own perspective, based on the interviews that we made available. And for us, it was important to demonstrate that art can play an important role in imagining and producing a real, quite different from what is currently hegemonic, and that art has the possibility to not only envision or proclaim ideas in theory, but to realize them materially. And so we hope we could make a contribution to frame these projects, which are usually not considered to be art projects. So where are we time-wise? I didn't. Mr. Timekeeper, how are we doing?
Okay.
How much?
You've got 5 more minutes, so you please present the third project. Yeah,
so I'll do it quick. I'll be quick.
No worries.
So the last one, as I said, is the archive of the Old Boys Network, and it's all projects I think that Geert is quite familiar with.
Yes.
For those of you who are not, the Old Boys Network described itself as the first cyberfeminist alliance, and it was active for 5 years. Founded in 1997, the connecting element of the network was the term cyberfeminism. The formulated concern of the organization was to create spaces in which cyberfeminists can research, experiment, communicate, and act. Such spaces include virtual ones as the Cyberfeminist server and the Old Boys mailing list, as well as temporary meetings such as workshops and international conferences. All the activities have the purpose of providing a contextualized presence for different artistic, theoretical, political formulations related to cyberfeminism. At times mysterious, at times transparent, OBN is setting an agenda for communication, intervention, production. So OBN was founded in 1997 in Berlin, and so the idea was born to use the invitation we had also received through Geert, amongst others, to hold the first Cyberfeminist International at the hybrid workspace during Documenta 10. From the beginning, we put a huge emphasis on our organizational form, which should remain flexible and at the same time adhere to certain principles. The slogan, the mode is the message, the code is the collective, was representative of our concern to include awareness of the conditions of production and presentation as an essential feature of the quality of a work, which is why it was also important to develop our own structures and organizational forms. Codifying the rules as part of the FAQ on our website made this approach transparent and acted as an invitation to join in, to question, and help shape the structure. In the 5 years that OBN was active, 3 international conferences were organized in different personal constellations. The first we have seen, so that is the manifesto that came out of Kassel. After Kassel, the next Cyberfeminist International followed 1999 in Rotterdam, and the very Cyberfeminist International 2001 in Hamburg. We published the conference proceedings with individual contributions in 3 printed readers. In addition, there were numerous appearances at international festivals and conferences and contributions by OBN to exhibitions and publications. So why an archive of OBN after such a long time? For many years, there was neither an internal from our side nor an external reason to deal with any of the material. I kept running the website and it was just sitting there, but not very much visited and interested. This changed only a few years ago when a resurgence of the topic of gender and technology led to several invitations for which I was asked to report on OBN. In this context, OBN is regularly referred to as a historical precursor, but little has survived that provides access to the networking spirit of the time, particularly the workings of the Old Boys Network. This lack of archival material has regularly led to misunderstandings and misinterpretations of OBN's work, leading on my side to the realization that existing historical files and documents should be collected and processed and transferred to an openly accessible archive. I expressed this at several public occasions, and in the end, it was Nora Sternfeld, Documenta professor in Kassel, who took the initiative to apply for funding and to create an OBN archive group. The idea was to turn the material that I had in my private possession into a public archive that would be hosted at Documenta Archive. My material would serve as the basis for a general OBN archive to which all participants in OBN events would be invited to contribute. So here's the archiving group. Dealing with such a hybrid collective and processual formation as OBN, there comes the question, who is entitled to create an archive of it at all? A question that arises especially in collective and network projects, while the participation of many theoretically brings with it a greater potential for sharing responsibility in collecting material. It is precisely this shared responsibility that often leads to a situation in which no one really feels responsible, or in which individuals have to take responsibility for the preservation of collectively produced work, including all its implications. So I have, I think, this just, tons of stuff I have still here. We'll hand it over beginning of April to the Documenta archive. So I find myself in partnering with not only the Kunsthochschule Kassel, a group initiated in the Documenta Studies Department, as I mentioned, but also a prestigious public memory institution with its own regulation and standards. And at the same time, I'm trying to do justice to this formation that does not exist anymore for more than 20 years, but which I still find relevant enough to engage in preserving its traces. So I think this was like three different, very different projects I'm involved in. And to conclude, I was participating in a museum workshop yesterday where we also addressed this concept of networks of care. And I think in all of these examples, you can see this idea of networks of care be practiced in some sort of or another. So this networks of care, at the heart of which is the idea of bringing distributed knowledges in exchange to complement each other's care work. The issue here seems to be that large memory institutions have certain standards according to which they organize inclusion into or exclusion from their responsibility. All the examples I shared today are beyond these standards because they fall out of the classical categorization along of authors and artworks. Therefore, I think when we demand more complex aesthetic practices to be included into public concerns of care, this first and foremost requires an expansion of what we consider to be aesthetic practices in the first place. Here we definitely need art theory to move forward into a more exciting and challenging future. So that's me. Thanks a lot. I hope I did not go too much over time. So these are just some more impressions from the archival work.
Thanks so much, Cornelia. We're not really that much over time, so that's good. I understood from Lima that they requested, a couple minutes break before we go to the discussion and the presentations of all of you. First of all, so I would say we come back in 3-4 minutes, and then we start with Liz Stainforth. So let's have a short break. Welcome back, everybody. We'll now have a series of 3 10-minute presentations. Then we quickly go back to Cornelia, and then we'll have a discussion between all of us here and also with you out there. So you can then post or voice your questions, and then we'll pick them up and discuss them here with the group. Next joins us from Leeds in the UK, Elizabeth Steinworth. Her presentation is called The Politics of Digital Heritage Aggregation at Scale. Liz is lecturer at the Heritage Studies in the School of Fine Arts in Leeds. Her research explores digital heritage and memory cultures and the politics of digital heritage aggregation. She published widely on these topics in journals such as the Digital Humanities Quarterly, International Journal of Cultural Studies, and the Memory Studies. Liz, go ahead.
Thank you for that introduction. So as you mentioned, I'm I'm not actually from a media art background. I do teach in a school of fine arts, but I'm here today more to talk about distributed knowledge infrastructures and the implications, I suppose, then for connecting to projects such as Cornelia mentioned in her presentation in terms of the commons, kind of creative practices connected to knowledge infrastructures. So I'm going to give a short presentation which draws from research I've undertaken on the political imperatives embedded in the technical design of digital heritage aggregation systems. And I think these constitute an important part of knowledge infrastructures for cultural heritage data. So I begin with a brief definition of heritage aggregators. So in the context of digital heritage, the term aggregator refers to systems that collect, format, and manage metadata from multiple providers and offer federated access to that data via services like online portals, websites, and APIs. So on the slide here, I've got some examples of aggregators, digital heritage aggregators. One is the not-for-profit project Digital Public Library of America. There is the European Commission-funded project Europeana, and the Australian National Library project Trove as well. So these are the three aggregators that I've carried out the most extensive research on, both individually and as part of a research collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Rhiannon Bativia, who's based at Simmons University in Boston. So aggregators drive towards standardization and information discovery across collections, reflect the aspirations of older universal knowledge systems to organize and classify the world. As Jeff Barker suggests, computerized databases are the outgrowth of a longer movement of standardization and universal classification, which became widespread in the 19th century. Consequently, many aggregators are presented as technical projects supported by developers who concentrate on the building and maintenance of their database functions. Yet they are also political and social projects made up of different partners and stakeholders. In some cases, the circulation of political language in turn influences the conceptualization and organization of aggregation activities. So to give an example, which I mentioned, I think, just now, Europeana, this is one of the largest aggregators of cultural heritage data, drawing together digital content from over 2,500 European museums, libraries, and archives. In practice, this means that it does not store content, rather it aggregates metadata about the content, making it findable via its search interface. The project has developed in the context of high investment through the European Union and member states and has an explicit transnational policy mandate. This is in keeping with the EU's cultural symbolic efforts to forge and popularize a cohesive European identity. The political shaping of Europeana has been acknowledged in some of its policy statements. As you can see here at the top, in the introduction to its 2020 strategy, it affirms Europeana started in 2008 as a big political idea to unite Europe through culture by making heritage available for all work, learning, or pleasure. But analysis of reports informing the planning for Europeana reveals the entanglement of technical development with less overt political aims. For instance, a European Commission report by a high-level expert group on digital libraries referred to the need for copyright reform and harmonization of European collections to create the appropriate conditions for mass digitization. Harmonization is the same term that is used by the cultural anthropologist Marc Abeles to describe the European political process itself. In European policy, harmonization and rationalization are a mode of influencing policy without spelling out the final political goals, he writes. A similar tendency can be discerned in Europeana's establishment of the European Data Model, or EDM. The EDM is a resource description framework designed as an integration medium for metadata sourced from different data providers, which is then harvested by Europeana. The point is to make data from disparate sources interoperable and cross-searchable. However, it could also be argued that the EDM's interoperability corresponds with the drive for greater European integration, especially because this kind of harmonization approach is not the only way of connecting collections data. These political dimensions of aggregation are seldom owned by developers. So, in a project like Europeana, the effect of harmonization and rationalization, is that it creates large and distributed knowledge structures, while at the same time establishing minimum standards of compatibility between distinct data sources, what Anna Singh has called effective generalization. In universal knowledge systems, this is the established method of dealing with scale for abstraction and classification. The negative implications of this approach is that aggregators risk codifying heritage within a sort of narrow representational framework. On the other hand, their broad reach may provide opportunities for the reimagining of cultural collections and heritage data. That could entail making content accessible across distinct professional and organizational boundaries, or creating new platforms for engagement. In particular, the idea of a distributed infrastructure implies different scales of knowledge making at the local, national, and global level, and the possibility of communication between them. In theory, at least then, aggregators hold the potential to address the problematic relation of the universal to the particular in their own knowledge systems. To go back to Europeana, there has been a recognition of this potential from various stakeholders, which is reflected in how the project has shifted its priorities over time. The emphasis on access to vast quantities of collections data in the original strategic planning did not speak enough to different local contexts for users to make this data meaningful. As Nick Paul, and you can see on the slide here, the former chair of the Europeana Foundation acknowledged, access as a principle has failed almost entirely because it is passive. We have had to learn to move on from passive provision of access to proactive engagement with audiences. In many of Europeana's more recent activities, proactive engagement is exemplified in the form of crowdsourcing projects to encourage users to share objects or family stories relating to significant historical events, and significantly also pan-European historical events. An alternative approach is to try to create the conditions for different forms of knowledge making. This is a process digital heritage scholar and historian Tim Sherratt has described as hacking. Working with the Australian aggregator Trove, which I mentioned at the beginning, Tim has carried out practice-based research focused on freeing aggregated data from the confines of the search bar. And you can see a couple of his projects in the slide. So in projects like Redacted, so the screenshot on the left, he inverts ideas of access by taking individual redactions from historical surveillance files and turning them into a discovery interface. It's his view that aggregation can enlarge the scope and meaning of access. Here, aggregation is being used to develop new modes of sharing, collaboration, enrichment, and reuse of cultural heritage collections. And also, I think, connecting to what's been said before, thinking about aggregators for creating more aesthetic practices as well. So these kinds of practices also present a challenge to the normal constraints of information discovery, and perhaps can help us develop critical perspectives on systems that have come to define the norms of what search is, such as Google. Google's algorithmic search is distinct from a database search aggregated data, but both have relied on the conventions of the search bar. The difference is that Google creates an illusion of the world that defines the parameters within which we can think and act. Due to data collection practices, our search knows us, anticipates us, and underestimates us, narrowing our scope for identifying alternatives. While digital heritage aggregators may never be our search default, what we can see is that given the right tools and priorities, they have the potential to disrupt the illusion of totality in algorithmic search. Projects like Tim's that utilize tools which make visible the partial nature of cultural collections data will ensure that aggregators can be as much a site of negotiation and knowledge production as one of information discovery. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. That was very clear, and we'll come back to this, because there are so many questions related to the, giant tech you just mentioned, Google, and let's discuss that later. We now go to Lozana. Are you there, Lozana?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, okay, good. Hello. Your presentation is titled Rethinking User Agency in the Context of Digital Cultural Archives. And you will give us a short presentation, and I'll read it. What are the dynamics between digital knowledge management infrastructures and the social and institutional contexts they get embedded in? 2 case studies, Rhizome's Archive of Net Art, Artbase, and the UK project, Digital Archives of Artists Publishing, showcase distinct approaches to working with collaborative open source software and linked open data protocols. In both cases, preserving digital cultural memory is facilitated through redistribution agencies across a broad network of actors, including designers and developers, institutional stakeholders and users. Lozana Rossenova is a digital humanities designer and researcher based in Berlin. In 2021, she completed her PhD at the Center of the Study of Network Image in collaboration with Rhizome, a leading international born digital. Let's discuss that. Rhizome was born here in Amsterdam. Okay. Her research focused on data presentation and performativity in linked open data archives. Currently, she is an associate researcher at the Open Science Lab in Hanover, Germany, working on the NFDT for Culture project for a natural research infrastructure of cultural heritage data. Rossenova is particularly interested in working with open source and community-driven approaches to digital infrastructure, which organize, store, and make knowledge and different ways of knowing accessible. Lozana, take the floor.
All right, thank you so much for this detailed intro and even bio there. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully everyone can see my slides.
Yep.
And yeah, so I will try to keep this to 10 minutes. I have to say this is cut from a longer presentation, so I hope it makes sense, but I'll try to introduce basically a few core concepts, and whatever, doesn't become super clear from the 10-minute slides, we can discuss later in more detail. And basically, I will talk about some of the methodological outcomes of my PhD research and kind of put this in the context of 2 specific applications. So to begin with, we have Rhizome. Yes, I'm happy to discuss the born digital element there. But Rhizome, for those of you who don't know, is an art organization founded in 1996, currently based in New York City, although with a very distributed team. And yeah, speaking of distributed knowledge, everyone in that organization really practices that aspect of the work as well. And since 1999, Rhizome have been maintaining an archive of net art called the Artbase. So the Artbase has over 2,000 artworks, primarily hosting net art, but also works that employ media such as software, moving image, games, and more. What is interesting about the case of the net art archive, specifically in relation to this idea of rethinking user agency, relates to the fact that net artworks are not single self-contained objects. And I'm sure I don't really need to go into detail about this to this audience here today, but just very briefly in short, to be performed and experienced, net art depends upon alignments between hardware and software environments, network protocols, and crucially, an active user. Without user interaction, the works cannot be rendered and experienced at all. So with my PhD research, I aim to unpack the question of user access in digital archives and how to support informed user interaction and potential for intervention. The embedded position at Rhizome allowed me access to Rhizome's archive materials and data repositories. At the beginning of my research in 2016, the Artbase had already been overhauled several times, both in terms of its backend infrastructure as well as front-end design. Mapping out the archive history timeline, I was able to piece together the specifics of how deeply decisions around archive policies, for example, things like, is the submission of artworks completely open, is it curated, is it closed, etc., the choices of the database infrastructure, and the digital preservation aspects around the works and how these were addressed or not by preservation staff, These questions were all entangled with questions of user access and interaction. So the practice of my PhD evolved through 4 phases, which are typically used in HCI, or human-computer interaction, and digital design, namely discovery, exploration, specification, and evaluation. Prototypes, data visualizations, workshops, user surveys, interviews. This all informed the development of a new data model and a new interaction design framework for the art-based archive, which were iteratively refined through these 4 phases. As core software for our database repository and interaction layer, we used Wikibase, a free and open source software that supports linked open data. The research outcomes of the PhD practice was a new reflective design framework, which operates both as a conceptual and methodological approach towards design practice for complex knowledge management systems. The framework is illustrated here in this diagram, and it consists of 3 material dimensions: a data model that structures the data according to specific ontological and relational protocols. So these relate to the metadata schemas and standards, which essentially are followed or not followed by the archive. Next, a database software which carries its own specific computational logic, and this could be a relational database or a graph database, or a different kind of database with each with its own specific possibilities for data structuring. And third, a user interface, which allows users to interact with the data in the database. And ideally, this user interface allows informed interactions and interventions rather than simply offering some pre-designed easy routes for the users. The material dimensions are not a vertical stack, but rather mutually interdependent and overlapping areas with fuzzy boundaries. These material dimensions enact and are acted upon by the processual dimensions, which I loosely group as activities of classification relating to data modeling, maintenance relating to both data content and database software, and of course, end use. Crucially, all of these activities are mutually constitutive. So users don't just use the archive, but partake in classification and maintenance processes too. The development of this framework was informed by my situated design practice, the work with users I conducted throughout the course of the research, and the close collaboration with institutional stakeholders and members of open source software communities. I want to highlight the activities carried out with users as foundational to addressing the question of user agency in the archive. Throughout different phases of my collaboration with Rhizome, we involved users into the redesign process through conventional methods like surveys and interviews. We gathered new data regarding key use cases among various user communities. And crucially, we wanted to engage users in co-design workshops that involved working with the Wikibase software and really starting to think through the question of how a linked open data environment might become legible to users that are more accustomed to other traditional archival interfaces. And by traditional, I mean super restrictive interfaces, right? Like interfaces that don't actually give you much agency. So we had some open calls and we ran workshop sessions, and the workshops produced materials like these sketches here and wireframes with various interpretations of how metadata might be structured around artworks and digital preservation processes. And the research process also involved frequent communication with various open source communities involved in the software that we were developing for the new art-based infrastructure. So reimagining the art-based interface in a way that could better support and make clearly visible to users all the efforts that went into producing and preserving the artworks required more than a redesign involving surface level branding and styling. Instead of thinking of the art-based interface as the top layer in a conventional technical stack consisting of software and hardware, it was more productive to consider the archive as a network of relations between users and digital infrastructure. And by users here, I actually include all the staff members, all the artists whose works were in the archive, programmers, academic researchers, and the general public. On a practical level, to support the agency of users in this network, we developed a user guide which provides specific context around the data model and the ontology so that users can get a deep dive view of how the data relates and is constituted in this archive. The linked open data structure of Wikibase is able to facilitate new types of user interactions in the archive, but these interactions need to be contextualized and open to interpretation and intervention. Much of this relies on the use of the protocol and query language called Sparkle. With Sparkle, data visualizations can showcase data relations, draw up timelines of changes to individual artworks over time, derivation, relations, and much more. To help users start working with Sparkle and formulate their own questions to the archive, we have provided a range of examples on pages in the archive wiki, just like this one here shown in the slides, alongside detailed documentation and tutorials. I want to emphasize that we didn't really go in for a visually led solution with the ArtBase. We focused much more on the data functionality and its interaction with the front end of the wiki software. We didn't use a custom front end because simplifying the complexity of our technical infrastructure seemed like a much more suitable solution for a long-term preservation approach. This is not to say that in the future there won't be a more custom front end, but rather that in this phase of the work, we were concerned with facilitating the possibility of user interaction with the data and the possibility for design intervention on the level of the database, rather than staying simply on the surface. So the interface you see here is a very basic wiki. It's nothing like too fancy. I hope I still have maybe just 2 more minutes. I'm sorry if I'm a bit going over time, but I do want to talk about, sorry, is it okay? 2 more minutes?
Sure.
I just want to briefly mention the kind of second case study because I think it provides a kind of alternative view to how you can still use this flexible infrastructure, but in a very different context. So yeah, here basically I applied my parts of the PhD methodological framework while thinking carefully about this different context, something other than net art. So this project is an archive of artists' books and publications initiated by the London-based artist-led experimental project space and reading room called Banner Repeater. And working collaboratively with the team of subject specialists, developers, and designers, we implemented a Wikibase instance here as well, but this time with the custom front end. And this is the view of the wiki, so it's just a normal wiki, and then there's this custom front end. Mm-hmm. The public of this archive was quite different from the Rhizome community. Obviously, it was more focused on material and print culture, and hence a more visually oriented interface was considered appropriate. The data model itself was less complex than Rhizome's, since although the publication objects themselves were still complex in their own way, the archive didn't focus on the digital preservation aspects, which added additional layers of complexity in the case of the ArtBase. In the context of this publication archive, a fairly straightforward interface that pulls a minimal amount of data, so this is the front end and this is the back end, we thought that this interface was sufficient. At the same time, users who wanted to get more actively involved in the archive were provided with both read and write access to the wiki, and a range of tutorial materials were prepared once again to help users uploading their own publications to the archive or enriching the archive with contextual data around other publications. Write access is only given to a closed community, but anyone who wants to join is welcome to submit a request to the archive administrators. We dubbed this approach an open closed community policy. The research and work, the whole process, of course, involved a lot of user research as well and workshops with a range of stakeholders, which are actually kind of still going on. Like, this process hasn't really finished. It's not a fixed, something you do before the design and then you design something. The workshops are ongoing, and even recently there was a workshop with the Tycoon Art Center in Hong Kong. Given the flexible structure of the Wikibase database and the linked open data's technical protocols, changing the data model and information architecture in response to user feedback around these kinds of workshops and changing needs, depending on the user context, is actually always an option. So in closing with this presentation, I just want to point to 2 further extensions of the PhD methodological framework that I have been developing alongside these practical archival projects. So these look basically very different from what you might consider traditional interface design work, but I believe that a crucial part of supporting the idea of active user communities involves these kinds of additional, extra design activities. So the first is designing for an open source archive that involves long-term community organizing and long-term community managing, and not just running a few workshops in the beginning. And the second aspect is also realizing the need to get actively involved in the open source communities of developers in order to be part of the decision-making process that shapes how software like Wikibase, for example, can evolve and meet the needs for distributed knowledge systems. So yeah, thanks very much. I hope this was kind of relatively clear presentation. I'm sorry if I raced through some of it, but I look forward to the discussion afterwards. I'm going to stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thanks, Lozana. And now we switch to Sao Paulo, Brazil. Hello, Giselle Beiguelman. Pleased to see you.
Yes,
you're
really
an
nice.
artist, professor at the School of Architecture and Urbanism at University of Sao Paulo. You will give a presentation here, The Future of Our Deep Fake Past. Among your recent works are the Portuguese language Hateland, covering online reactions to violence against vulnerable groups in Brazil, and a co-authored book about the storage and preservation of digital artworks and an ongoing investigation of the colonialist imagination in 20th century artworks using artificial intelligence. Giselle, go ahead.
So thank you very much for the introduction. I first of all thank you for the invitation. So good to see you, Geert Lovink, and so many years. And also, before starting, I apologize for my accent, for my English. I think that I'm the only one that it's not quite in the European system. So I can assure you that my Portuguese is wonderful and perfect. So please forgive me for any mistakes. So as already said, my point of departure is this new wave of deep fakes and artificial intelligence that are embedded in many apps, and how they forge a new culture of memory and past. So I think that we can say, as I will try to show in 10 minutes, that it's true, as many, it's quite a common sense to say that the internet never forgets, but I would say that digital culture does not allow us to remember. So from this, let me share my screen, and let's see, here we are. Okay, you are with me now, right? So my point of departure in this discussion is the coloniality of the archive. There is a lot of discussion on how to decolonize archives, and distributed processes could be a strategy for this. It would not be an exaggeration to say that one of the global themes in social media, in the press, and among experts in the areas of, in the field of historical heritage, art history, archiving, is, for instance, what to do with monuments that refer to slave traders, dictators, and the colonial system as a whole. But I totally agree with Jürgens and Carabinos when they say that the aspiration to decolonize colonial legacies seems to be a paradoxical statement, since there is something innately colonial in the record-keeping systems that cannot and should not be removed. After all, the institutional places of memories, such as museums, libraries, archives, no matter if they are offline or online, are technologies of power. And much before the archive became, I'm quoting Ariela Aisha Azulay, much before the archive became the site where the fantasy of world's history, of all, or of a universal history of humankind from its early times could be materialized. It was a regime based on the allocation of different roles and places to masses of people who were supposed to be kept in their right place, and masses of people that were erased from these places as well. Nevertheless, when we take all those conditions together in order to think about the distributed archive on the internet that could be the counterpart of these systems, we have to face two different challenges. The first one, and many of the presenters already talked about this, and Cornelia did a wonderful presentation, is obsolescence, and I would add storage in the walled gardens of social media and the giant corporations that take control of all our practices. We produce and publish on petabyte scales using services that can disappear at any time. Our equipment crashes at the speed of a click, and a strange, weird nostalgia for a non-lived past invades the pop culture circuit, with what I think it's symptomatic of the state of overdoses documentation and continual loss and 404 messages. So how to deal with such unstable memories that disappear along with equipment lifespan, and whose types do not correspond to the cataloging models of museums and archives collections. I would say that how to think, in one phrase, how to think on the future of memory in our Botox culture and data colonial environment. That it's the second point of the difficulties of thinking on the future of memory. The first one, of course, is obsolescence and storage. And the second one, which is my focus today in some 5 minutes, is the meaning of past in our Botox culture. What I'm calling Botox cultures is what memories are we building? I find myself asking all the time, what memories are we building on networks where the most immediate present seems to be the absolute time? What does past mean in the app bubbles, promises of miracle AI solutions with a lot of deep fake technologies to erase wrinkles, colorize pictures, and even animate scenes and faces of dead celebrities and personal ancestors? The questions multiply and indicate the urgency of the discussion on memory in the contemporary culture field as a prerogative for thinking on digital media preservation. So the examples you see here are in all any kind of social media accounts, and I think that the most disturbing of all of them is the deep nostalgia phenomena of last year, that it's still captivating many followers, and it's the first this deep fake all devoted to the reinvention of the past. So it's the same technology applied to fictionalize a past that we never had. So I ask, what kind of future we will have when our memories will be this kind of images, all free of time? They have no wrinkles, they have this colored atmosphere of an idealized European light that did not convince anyone living in the South when you see those pictures colored by artificial intelligence apps. So I think that how can you think and debate distributed knowledge, distributed archive, distributed forms of digital media preservation, when all we have is not just our net art production, the global heritage of the past time and the heroic culture, European culture from the 16th century, 17th century, and so on. And this will be the future of the material to be archived. So what will be this memory culture in some years? So if our question was what to remember, facing all that we have discussed today about obsolescence, most corporate giant media monopolies and their APIs. So what to remember also in this culture of over-documentation that social media pushes us all the time. We are all the time publishing in our Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok accounts. So the question is, what memories are we building on networks, and what does past mean in the app bubbles promises of all these AI solutions, and how can we remember something if all we produce does not have any, it's a kind of timeless based media that doesn't have past nor present, and probably don't have any kind of future. Because of this, my statement is that the internet never forgets, and maybe it's true because of those monopolies, they are showing us that it is true. But digital culture does not allow us to remember anymore. And I think to discuss the distributed archive, the new forms of storage, we must also pay attention to this movement of data colonialism that is erasing any kind of possibility of the experience of time. So if we do not have the experience of time, we do not have any sense of history, we do not have any possibility of preserving anything. Everything we have are those faces, super shining faces that are built every day in our stories and social media posts. I think that there is a lot of stuff to discuss, but I only have 10 minutes, as you know.
Thanks.
Here are my contacts, and thank you very much.
I would propose we go now back to Cornelia Sollfrank for her contribution for the debate, and maybe Cornelia, you could already respond to a few of the presentations we just heard.
Well, I already had my 10 minutes, so I will just try to respond quickly to this idea of the distributed knowledge. That is the topic of the afternoon on distributed knowledge production, and also kind of respond a little bit to what I saw in your presentations. First with Liz, the Europeana was interesting because I was also invited at one point to contribute something, and I don't remember many details, I have to say, but just I remember a feeling. I felt very misplaced there with my interests, and I had very much the idea it was a top-down construction that was built with a lot of effort, but it was not really considering to what kind of users or communities it would be speak or be relevant. And So that for me was like a typical institutional, highly funded attempt to create a kind of a public memory institution, or this kind of exchange system. So that was my remark to that. Compared to what Lozana introduced, I saw your presentation that you also did at the lounge with Rhizome, and I thought the work with Wikibase is incredibly interesting, and also what it allows to do, and that it so much involves and has the user in consideration. And also for me, I remember the most, and also what I wanted to say about Rhizome compared to the Europeana. Rhizome is also an artist initiative. I'm not so sure how digital or where exactly it was born or not. I remember it was Mark Tribe back in the days, sometimes 96 or 97, and that it was highly contested when he started working on Rhizome, if this is the right approach, and this is, if it should be done and how it should be done, and so on and so forth. But I think it's still, I mean, if you look at Rhizome today, it's highly professional. It's a wonderful resource, which is very unique. And I think it's important to mention that it was initiated by an artist, but an artist who developed it into a really kind of a huge professional infrastructure, which is a bit different from the examples that I showed earlier, which is also interesting to see. My consideration about the Wikibase was I thought it's such a great model, but again, it is limited to a certain community and to a certain field of works and interests. And I remember having a discussion with Dragan at one point where he said he would be very interested and busy at the moment to connect this idea of the Wikibase, to expand it, to motivate traditional bigger art institutions to use the same software, and how difficult that is. So we again have, I mean, it's a great model, but it only stands and works within this community, let's say, and some affiliated institutions. But the question for me there is how could it be connected and expanded to include other networks as well, or other memory institutions? And is this desirable at all? I think with all these examples, there's always a question of scale and so on and so forth. And of course, when you talk about distributed knowledge, it's a wonderful idea, but then immediately the question evolves, if it's very distributedly located, what are the protocols, you know, between the different actors and players to connect? Because without that protocols, nothing can happen. And then it's be an initiative and a negotiation about that, and all of that. Regarding the last presentation of Giselle, I find it very interesting. Also, the examples you had and the questions you ask. What we will remember when we look later at all these fake pictures of our present and past. And here for me the question really was, or there was an tension for me emerging, because what you showed is mainly like popular culture, let's say, you know, if you look at social media and so on. Before we were more looking into art institutions, museums, art base, and like professional memory institutions. And I think there is a huge tension also there. If we look at the one side, I mean, the power that these big corporations have, the data colonialists, you know, in terms of building memory, and what is their relation to public memory institutions, for example, in this question. So that was my quick remark, and I really have nothing more to add at this point, except that I make, for me, the difference is really important, you know, to look or to distinguish between this top-down approaches and the bottom-up approaches, and how they can expand and relate it in a meaningful way.
I would like to dig a bit further into this, because I think it is an attention that really defines our age, this age of platform capitalism, of social media monopolies. Cornelia, I find it interesting that you kind of put it aside as popular culture, and that you kind of almost choose an elitist approach and say, okay, there's the high culture and the low culture in internet. And, you know, I came from the
internet.
70s. Yeah. Let me just, you can answer later.
Yes.
You have presented initiatives that, you know, explicitly see themselves either as, you know, really pirate archives, or archives that deal with the problematic of copyright. We could say many of them are at least, let's say, counter-hegemonical, right? Whether they are straight out pirate and really openly question the power relationships, I would say remains to be seen. That's probably different for each and every of the projects. However, how do we relate these two realities? Because I am with Giselle, and I would say that up to I think 80 or 90% of time spent on the internet is in that bracket of low culture, and that automatically puts everything that is art or heritage or archive related into an extremely marginal position, right? Now we can say, okay, we first have to accept that before we can change it. But of course, there was a time when, for instance, you know, through the use of a kind of a democratic idea of the search engine and a culture of search, these two positions were somehow brought together, right? In this age of recommendation, of links, likes, there is no more search, and this is putting us in a really, really difficult position when we are dealing with archives, because the archives, all of them, whether they are Europeana or the really small initiative that you know, Cornelia presented, or Rhizome for that matter, they are somewhat search dependent. How is the user you know, coming there in the first place, right? And if we look at how the let's say Generation Z, but also a part of the millennials grow up these days, they are really, really inside those very, very large cages where they no longer search, and they will never ever find all the rich materials that we have seen here. And I would say, you know, let's discuss this. I would invite Giselle and Cornelia to you know, see how these two quite opposite positions, how they relate today. And of course, Liz and Lozana can also.
Maybe just to clarify this one thing, that's not a distinction I made, but what I said, I see a tension between these two, right?
It's obvious
because the public, So that was just an observation.
Getting bigger, and the gap between, let's say, that social media realm and the realm of you know, what we here in Amsterdam. Or very optimistically called the public stack or the commons, or, you know, there are various names for it. That gap is growing and growing.
So I don't think it is an opposition. I think that this is another layer of the discussion. I really believe that what we are doing on the internet is the culture of a significant part of our culture. So the idea it's not to confront high and low culture, the institution against the social media crowd, but the opposite, to take into account that you have millions of people feeding those platforms with their memories. We, in some ways, our memory was commissioned by those big enterprises. I've been thinking, what will happen when YouTube crashes and everything is flat? What will be the coronavirus memory? What it will be? We will not have, because or otherwise, or it is on Facebook now, Meta Universe archives with Instagram and Facebook, or it is at Google archives. So at one point it will happen as happened with GeoCities, and we have this wonderful piece about the trying to archive GeoCities and the memory of the Internet 1.0, that it's the aesthetics of the 90s, that all the practices and our utopias, that we will share knowledge, that we will storage things, that everybody will access this. So I think that this is one point. The other point that I would go, I need to put on the table when there was no time to, that it's relevant to take into account what it is produced on social media, because especially for those that were erased from institution collections, like the indigenous people from Brazil and all Latin America, and also from United States, they are rebuilding their past on social media, that it's a huge force in their social movements. So it's not just, I focused on the pop urban culture, that for me it's something that I really take into account, not just quantitative, but from a qualitative point of view, but also because these spaces are the spaces where all those who were outside from the traditional archive, from indigenous people to Black people, are building their new archives. So this, I think, it's our challenge today. Not just to think about the relevant questions that you put, and I totally agree with everything you show with us, but to add another layer to the conversation, that is to decolonize the archive, is to face data colonialism as well.
Liz, you need to also join, because you spoke about aggregators. You briefly mentioned Google, but you didn't even come close to, let's say, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, etc. They are the aggregators, of our time. So how do you relate, the institutions that you looked at in relation to these big tech giants?
I think it's really interesting to go back into the history of some of these projects, which started kind of in the early 2000s, and to see, I think Giselle kind of touched on it in some way, like the optimism of this kind of idea of a democratic search environment. And there was, I think, as I say, a lot of cause for optimism among some of the, organizations that were involved in the early work around some of these aggregators, which were principally libraries, like big national libraries. The idea that, the web directory kind of format of some early search engines were really building off of search catalogs, search library catalogs. So I think there's something interesting there about how there was a real misapprehension with when some of these projects started, or at least there was optimism, but it's been kind of outpaced by the reality of commercial search, which, as you said, is not really like search at all. Like the era of web personalization changes this completely. So I think there's something really interesting in how actually some of these companies were inspired in some way, you know, like conceptually. Yeah. The origin of search comes from these kinds of initiatives, like the kind of the big library catalog initiatives, the universal knowledge, you know, to organize and make useful, or, you know, to make universally accessible and useful all the world's knowledge, I think was Google's, maybe even still is Google's motto. So I do think there's something, and there's a flip that happened at some point. And of course now these initiatives are, that's where they want to be. You know, there is like a kind of course there is an acceptance that these commercial platforms are where people engage with and consume the majority of culture. So there's kind of been a switch around in terms of trying to put the data into those places, get the kind of exposure for the data into those places, with a less emphasis on arriving at the kind of the search bar, which, you know, they set up in terms of their front end. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think they're in a real, I think it's not something they can easily negotiate. That's why I was trying to sort of focus on those creative practices that have tried to kind of make the data matter differently in some of these different contexts. You know, some of the creative projects that have come out of sort of using APIs and things like that, rather than relying so much on the logic of search that is set up in the kind of portal system of an aggregator. Sorry. You're muted, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Somebody's muting me, so I don't really understand. Should I be a chair or not? Muting the chair is a little bit... I'm happy to give back this role, but that's a little bit weird. Lozana, can you say something about this dilemma? Because Rhizome is acutely aware of all these issues based in New York, facing with the massive presence in American culture of exactly those social platforms. You have studied, with people there, their wishes and desires to have different user interfaces, which I think is extremely brave. If you look at the poverty of interface culture today in today's platform landscape. So how does this play out in the case of Rhizome and for you?
Thank you. Yeah, I do think indeed this is extremely interesting direction of the discussion we're taking, and I think kind of nicely segueing into user agency question, right, which is my topic as well with my research. I do think, well, I can say lots of critical things, right, but let's not go there. I would like to stay positive and point out that earlier today, before this second half of the afternoon started, we had a workshop around the use of Wikidata. And I want to counter a bit what Cornelia said earlier about Wikibase, because I think with Rhizome pioneering the use of Wikibase in 2015, they sort of once again showed that usually artists go there first, but now Wikibase is becoming extremely mainstream, I would say. And Wikidata itself, which was the topic of the workshop earlier, is the biggest public instance of Wikibase. It has billions of statements and many, many millions, almost, I think 97 million items right now in Wikibase, and many hundreds of thousands of editors. So at scale, this shows that, yes, we can look to Google and social media and these really, really problematic places. But we also have to address the fact that there are really thousands and thousands of people who are actively working in other spaces. And Wikimedia, I think, for all its flaws, and let's not forget, it is also in some ways a colonial project, but it has provided, I think, a platform for many people to exercise agency. And I see Wikidata again, as a flawed, in many ways, platform. There's like toxicity there, and sort of problems with like openness and kind of harmful behavior by certain people, etc. But it is a proof of concept that something like Wikibase can work at scale, and that institutions embracing Wikidata is showing that institutions can also look to different, more open platforms to share their data, etc. I also want to point out that Rhizome started in 2015 with their Wikibase project. The other showcase I had, again, an artist-led project, right, much smaller scale, but still artist project, seeing the potential in this around 2018, 2019. Now, last year I finished my PhD and I was immediately hired on this large-scale national German, and I don't want to like sound like I'm, oh, look at me, I finished a PhD and I started a job, but it is a national scale project in Germany for national research infrastructure. And I was hired because of my expertise in Wikibase, because Wikibase is right now considered the official solution for an absolutely enormous scale research infrastructure for all kinds of sciences, cultural heritage data, etc. And I mean, just this week, it's kind of fascinating that I've been on like, I think 3 or 4 different events this week, specifically focusing on the potential of Wikidata and Wikibase to serve research and cultural heritage, and the kind of data that we care about, the kind of data we don't want to leave to the Googles of the world to handle. So I personally like to stay positive and think that there is there's alternatives out there. But the second thing I have to say is it takes work, right? Like designers cannot be just sitting there like making nice visual things. I think this is really important to emphasize. I had to really work on my PhD to enter a completely different world. I wanted to, familiarize myself with concepts from STS and social science and anthropology, and really study how people think through these interfaces and how these things work. And my emphasis on community building and the fact that, I'm still part of these many different user groups and developer communities, because although sometimes it's not comfortable, sometimes I have to really assert myself in a very, let's say, male dominated space or whatever. I think it's important. Like designers have to make an effort to meet users halfway, give user more opportunities to exercise agency, but really work, and don't just sit there pixel pushing, like go out and not only do user studies, but build communities and show the potential to communities that these alternative softwares can have, be part of open source culture, etc. Anyway, sorry, I'm going to stop there, okay, but I just wanted to share this more positive note, I guess.
Mm-hmm. All right. Somebody wants to respond here, or because I would like to go to another topic that it was in all your presentations somehow, but although not explicitly framed and mentioned like that. And this is the question of curation of information, if we turn it into archives, and the question of the role of individuals in the curation, or as many of you have in fact have mentioned, the question of collaborative or collective curation. Is this an approach? Or obviously, the wiki approach, is by definition a collective approach. However, Cornelia, the examples that you gave are very interesting in that sense, that they are kind of initiated and often run by very idiosyncratic individuals that somehow maintain quite large systems that everybody starts to wonder about how the hell are they doing this, right? There is something beautiful, about the idiosyncratic archive. And we often, go to those archives to visit them, right? Because there are, even in history, there are beautiful archives that, were made by certain individuals. And by the way, very often museums are, of course, started through collections that were made by individuals, right? So how do we look at collective and individual curation, and maybe now not related to that monolith of the platform, but just as a strategy?
Well, because you addressed me earlier, I can say something about these pirate archives and the, you know, it's I indicated it's different with the different platforms how the information arrives to be at the platforms. There are models like UbuWeb, where Kenneth himself and only he decides what is on the platform. There is other models like Monoscope, which is right on the other side of the scale. You can request to become a user and then you can start uploading the stuff. So when we did the workshop with him where someone complained because something is not there, and then he made her user and said, yeah, then put it there if it's missing, you know. So there's all different models. I think what they all have in common is it's not only about the curation, but then also the responsibility of the technical infrastructure, you know, because it's also individuals that decide on, that make this design decision when it comes to technology. And it's very often driven by a very individual passion about certain things they want to explore and so on and so forth. So I think it has both aspects. It is actually what is driving these platforms, that there is like an individual passion behind, but that's also like the downside of it, because it very often depends on individuals really to keep it up or to keep it alive and running. And I think, or one of the results for us thinking about it was that I think the crucial point is always that you find a solution and infrastructure to turn this initial passion, which needs to be there in a more distributed system that can also, where people can leave and new people can come in. I think that this, with all kind of self-organization structures, it's the same thing. It's not only in this technical system. So it's either a construction that depends on one person, you know, putting in all their effort and passion and resources, or it is possible that this person passes on and opens up the system, and that are the ones that survive on the long term. So that is one.
Can you say something about that?
One.
Yeah.
This passing on. Yeah, I mean, there's one example in Brussels, Constant, that you also know. That is a collective that do research mainly in the meantime on in media culture and different fields. They have a number of research projects meanwhile, and that is a very interesting example because it was never really only associated with one person or with a small group of people, but it has a history. So they made sure that in their DNA it was inscribed that it can be handed over, and it's a form. They found a form of organization which allows people to come in, and there's people that also leave after a time and are able to pass on the responsibilities, which also means, of course, that the character and the face of the organization changes, but then you have to let it go. So yeah, that's one example where it works well, but usually it's a very problematic point, you know, just to find this transition and to understand that this is a crucial point if you want to have an organization, if you want it to survive, you know, to open it up and to delegate responsibilities.
Yeah, Lima, the organization that hosts this debate here, is of course another example of a conglomerate of Amsterdam-based video art initiatives that came together, and the archive is now, or at least what's almost 50 years old, probably. And so it has passed on from different groups and individuals to the next. And and here's another example of a very small art initiative that takes up that historical responsibility to care for archived works. But Liz, can you say something about how you look at this from the initiatives that you studied, because they seem to emphasize a bit more on the technical and the protocol side, the metadata. We haven't really spoken about them yet, but how do you look at this, what we're discussing here?
Yeah, I liked what you said about the idiosyncrasy of the archive, and you were sort of referring potentially to a physical archive, but that's also a question then for what we have digitally created, born digital media art, and also for those collections, which I suppose Europeana is dealing with principally like digitized objects, digital object metadata. And so I think that idiosyncrasy question is a really important one to consider in the context of digital culture as well. And when we're thinking about, I spoke about the European data model and how it's kind of created a sort of minimum standard of compatibility across disparate data sources, which is what allows you to kind of do the search. But there are projects now which I think are utilizing different approaches, and this connects a bit to I think what Lozana was talking about, and I liked what you were saying, Lozana, about the kind of optimistic aspect of Wikibase and like the community of users, and trying to kind of advocate for using those approaches, because a project that some of my colleagues are involved in, which is connected to a project in the UK, a big project in the UK called Towards a National Collection. They have been involved in a project called Heritage Connector, which is using Wikidata. It's using a different approach, basically. And in a sense, it doesn't try to create that minimum standard of compatibility across collections. It's using Wikidata to sort of create knowledge graphs, and also some AI technology as well, to sort of almost like be able to create and posit constellations between collections, so people can kind of then use that and interrogate that to for research purposes or for general purposes. So it's not kind of requiring that there's that extra step to make the data compatible. As I say, it's more using the knowledge graphs and the Wikidata, these constellations or connections. So that was something that occurred to me in terms of like being able to preserve idiosyncrasy when you're thinking about the projects that I look at, and a different kind of approach to metadata, for example.
Giselle, would you like to join us in this conversation and tell us something about, the bottom-up archives in Brazil that you know of, or are part of, that can be comparable to what we're discussing here? Outside of the social media
environment. Yeah. I first of all, I must just stress that I think that the most important thing you all already talked about, that is this curatorial, especially Cornelia, when she was answering you, and taking into account also Lozana considerations, the difficulties implied in the act of agency. Now, creating in a distributed model is to be all the time creating conditions for participations, what is very difficult, and it's a lot of work. But I think, in Brazil, I think that the conditions are a little bit different, because the basics are very difficult. No, the access to the internet, the access to the equipment. So to think about in distributed models is always concentrated around contemporary art, the urban activism. This is not something that it's not relevant. It's super important. But to think in wow, how would it be to make a parallel archive for the Amerindian history or art, that it's not just the contemporary art, but all the production, that it's more aesthetic and not see itself as art or culture, different practices. So I think this is the one of the most challenging points, how to build this without excess. But besides this, I think that there is a problem that it's global, that it's kind of a digital literacy, how to empower the contributors, not to be just users, but to be proponents of things, not to just, everything I'm talking here is not that I don't consider important everything that it's available now, but how to go further, that you not just, that it's not enough to have the form, the place to tag, but to invite people, wow, you think it's not good, how would you do? But this question, this doesn't have any kind of space in our technological culture. So I think that's something that comes in parallel, that it's more transdisciplinary, as Lozana and Liz stated, is this model that you deal with many fields of knowledge, not just social sciences, but also a pedagogy for the digital world. This is something that we cannot avoid anymore, because we are becoming kind of the traditional and default users. We are used by those giants, and you use media like them. So this, I think, that the challenge. I'm involved in a project with my students, so it's very, very, very specific, from the best university and richest university in Latin America, that it's the De Monumenta project. And the pedagogic experience was very interesting. How to deal with 3D modeling, art history, counter narratives to our monuments that are terrible as in Europe, and to produce together a platform making this knowledge available. The platform is really square. You go there and you see. But the process for doing this was really a challenge. So it was much more successful experiences in distributing, creating from a pedagogical point of view that involved this time and space for thinking on how to do this, in which ways we can do it, and how can you model and think at the same time on the contemporary art demands in the field of sculpture and three-dimensional. So I would stop here, but there are some points around that are a little bit different.
Who would like to respond? Go ahead.
I feel like I really completely agree with what Giselle was saying, because the point of digital literacy and kind of almost onboarding users into this mode of, not just passively consuming information, but like really actively understanding how things work and being able to contribute. This is really at the kind of, core of my sort of ideas of how we as my community of designers can, contribute towards expanded user agency in digital contexts. And I think, if we go back to the more narrow case of metadata and cultural archives, so what Liz was talking about, I think, it's a job of, yes, designers, working closely with users to, increase digital literacy and work with more open platforms. But it's also about thinking whether our metadata standards, really enable this kind of active curation also by users, because a lot of metadata standards have various colonial, and by colonial, I don't just mean, negative kind of terrible terminologies, but also very closed nature. Like these things were just for specialists, right? Like Mark 21, oh my God, only librarians can work with this thing. I know because my mom is a librarian. So, since I was 5, I know what this thing is, but it is really difficult for, everyday people walking down the street who may be designers, scientists, or artists to grasp and participate. So one of the things that I think linked open data does really well, it does sort of remove this layer of like, oh my God, we have to have these extremely stringent metadata standards, and if we don't have them, like we can't perform any kind of search, and like nothing is findable. With linked open data, things are findable on a more open way. There are still issues with linked open data, but one of the things that I think Wikibase and Wikidata are nice platforms for, not because they're just wikis, but because they make linked open data much more accessible, right? Linked open data was this kind of pipe dream for a few tech bros in the early 2000s, and then since we have Wikidata in 2011, 2012, oh my God, we have so many more people embracing like linked open data. Places like the Met Museum, a fairly traditional institution, contributing hundreds of thousands of things to Wikidata. Tate Modern have like contemporary art data on Wikidata. This is also really unheard of, I think, in the world of big and very well established institutions dealing with contemporary art. So I guess, yes, we need more digital literacy, 100%. Designers need to get more involved in, developing accessible ways to bring in the users into actively working with the data. But also we have to think about, do we really want to hold on to these old school metadata standards that are very much about gatekeeping, about, you have to have an MLIS degree, right? Otherwise you don't understand any of these things. So anyway, I think this is just
I would like to ask Cornelia to give an example, because you just finished or about to finish the Old Boys Network archive together with in this archive in Kassel of the Documenta. And how did you there deal with these questions of tagging, archiving, technical standards?
It was rather interesting. I think for both sides, it was quite an experiment, because they usually don't take on any estates. In a way, what we provide is an estate. It's kind of a close collection of information related to one project, not one person. So the only 2 other estates they have is by 2 in Germany famous male artists of the 80s. And now they have the Old Boys Network. So they wanted to open up, they wanted to experiment, they wanted to also make send a signal out and say, okay, we are trying something else. And of course, the question was how to do it. I think before I answer this, I would really like to stress that this collaboration is only possible through the initiative of Nora, who was professor in Kassel and who knew me and my work and kind of the niche and this field, and had the sense of the relevance of it. And she had this position in Kassel, and she had access to the archive director, and she was mediating. Otherwise, this director of the archive, she would never talk to me in her whole life, an artist who has something that they think is relevant for Documenta archive. So, yeah. So that is something important to stress, how not only that these collaborations are kind of interesting and fruitful, but how do they happen in the first place? How can they happen? And then the Documenta archive has a new director, which I think is very helpful. And from the beginning on, at our first meeting, she said that she's totally into techno-feminism and she loves that field, and she would like to build a special department, collecting all the information on cyberfeminism, where then the Old Boys Network, our material would just be part of it. And I thought, wow, I was just, wow, okay, I hear you. When it comes to the inventory, that was quite interesting, because before we started even working, we had a little event where we invited different let's say, archival experts who we trust, who we know, who have a critical attitude, who have tried out, who have a lot of practice experience, amongst them Laurence Rassel, who built an interesting archive in Barcelona with the Fondation Tapies, Michael Hildbrunner from Zurich, for example, who is an incredible archivist whose mission really is to find ways to integrate this more peripheral art projects initiative into the canon by finding ways how to translate the one into the other without, destroying it. And his last project that he made a huge archive of the F&F school, which was one of the first and big independent art schools, which still exists in Switzerland, and which has a long history, over 50 years now. And he got funding to build an archive of this. It was an amazing project. It's really fantastic. So he has a sense of this kind of underdog, under the radar projects, and wants to make them visible and integrate them in public institutions, simply because these institutions have a lot of resources, that no one else has, and to make use of that. So that was also our motivation. And from the beginning on, I said, well, it's a process. Let's see how it goes and what happens. We can stop it at any time. I can always do a pirate archive. We have this back door. It was more also really an experiment to see how it goes. And then all the archivists we talked to, they kind of convinced me that it's essential to kind of, make a reasonable inventory. And we ended doing this spreadsheet which I quickly showed in my presentation. I was never a fan of spreadsheets my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And now I am, I have to say.
Yeah.
Because not only for that purpose, but also, when you think about data visualization and what is possible, how you can visualize data and make them attractive for users to explore and go in, you can do incredible things once you have them properly archived and listed, So it's an incredible basis for all kinds of uses and transformations of this information later. And once I realized what the power is of this such a spreadsheet and how easily you can transform it in all kinds of different forms, I was basically then up to do it, and also to see what happens. And of course, we were struggling a long time with how do we categorize, and we started just listing all the items, but how do we sort them in a meaningful way, and all that. That was a process where there's a lot of I don't know, we talked to the archivists, they gave advice, sometimes we found it meaningful, sometimes not. I think in the end we have this really fantastic spreadsheet, which I'm totally proud of now, which contains a lot of information, meta information. Also, just creating that made me revisiting a lot of events. I didn't remember the names anymore. I had to get in touch with people and see, can you remember this person on this photo, who it was, and so on. So it was already a lot of memory work included in building and writing up this information. And the thing is, for now, that's something I didn't have time to say. For now, we hand over the material and the inventory to the Documenta archive. They are themselves in the middle of a huge transition of rebuilding a digital archive. So that's why we don't have a finished solution at the moment for the OBN archive to be publicly available. But that is the plan. So it will be part of the new platform. It will get its own space there, and there will be further work to do. So, and I'm also ready for them. And maybe we need to consult Lozana when we are starting to work on it, how it could look like. Yes, I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yes. Thanks. Yes, of course you did. Giselle, I want to go over to you again, and maybe we can explore a little bit more the idea of this methodology, how to decolonize archives, because you've touched upon it. I was curious if you meant really old archives there, or if you were in fact also referring to Instagram, Facebook, Google, which are obviously also very large structures that are in need of that. Where could we see beginnings of this? Where do you see it around you?
I was thinking in both sides at the same time, how to decolonize the institutional and former archive, and how to build new archives that are not shaped by the colonial mind, since the tools we have, their point of departure is already the structure of the old archive, the old library, with all those hierarchies from top to bottom, from man to what before the man. So this structure is the colonial mind. It's inside me, is inside you all, and we were shaped by this colonial mind. So to decolonize the archive, first of all, means to open the archive for what is missing. That is what it was undocumented, and not create this document. So how to put this history there? I have a lot of friends of mine that their grandparents came as slaves to Brazil. They are the third or fourth generation. We are the last one all over the world. We had slavery till almost the beginning of the 20th century. So it's still very present. And today, because of many changes in the macro politics of having different kinds of students at the universities, public universities, first of all, above all, this changed a little bit. But these people, they do not have records from their past history. They do not have pictures. They do not have the real names of their ancestors, that their names were new names since they arrived to the colonial territories. This is something very similar to what happened in Australia, for instance. So, but here is still very present. So to decolonize the archive is to open the archive for new modalities of knowledge and memories, because of course all those groups, they have memories, but those memories must came from different sources that are not the traditional sources, and how to keep them. So I think that the challenge, I talked a lot about the data colonialism that I think that embraces we all, but when we think about the future of the archive, and digital technologies are one of the main points of those strategies, because it is distributed. It can be distributed. It can imply different practices, but there is a lot of work to do in how to decolonize the archive.
At the same time, Brazil has an unprecedented and very heavy use of social media, and this contrast is just so large, right, between the absence of what you just spoke about, and then the heavy use of social media also among the poor, right? We're not just talking about the middle class here, huh?
No, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons, just blankets for we are in a terrible political situation. You all know the worst president in history is this is our merit. Bolsonaro is something that I would not desire for my enemies. But actually, this. One of the reasons that we are at where we are now is because of this massive use of WhatsApp, Telegram, and Twitter. This is their paradise.
And how do we deal with that reality in terms of archiving? Because as we know, they will not be concerned with that, right? And it, as you said in your presentation, it's kind of a Botox memory that disappears instantaneously, and it creates a culture of not remembering, of an instantaneous, perpetual kind of presence. And how can counter strategies be developed in such a dreadful situation?
So I think that we really need to create methods for archiving all these kinds of discourse. For instance, the history of our last election, or the Donald Trump election and the last American election. Nobody will be able to rewrite this history because it happened in those underground points of the internet that they are those app bubbles where they construct the small bubbles. So I think our challenge is really how to face those giants that they have an ethic compromise to share with us. If we are building our memories in WhatsApp, in YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, this should be a kind of transnational legal and ethics system that how can we have access of not just what was memorized about us, that we have our tracks everywhere, but to get back, not my...
Do you see artists doing this, Giselle? Do you see collectives or social movements kind of on an exodus to take the data out of these platforms and take them elsewhere?
I think that artists are more committed to make clear that this is happening and how it is happening. I think there are a lot of organizations, for instance, Axioma.org from Slovenia. They have a lot of research around this phenomenon of the global surveillance and how much data is stored about us. But actually, I think that in some ways, this guy that it's based in Berlin, his name, Harvey, that it's working with the Syrian archive to create a counter methodology for using a counter engineering process for tracking metadata from YouTube and show the problem of the bombing in Syria, the Syrian archive. I think that this project is a very good example on this, or how to track what is tracked about us. But maybe one of the most important works I know is from this guy from Harvey and his work with the Syrian archive. It's the V2, let me check the name. That it's just but but I think that you know which kind of
yeah, sure. It goes also
work.
in the direction, of course, of forensic architecture and many others who, you know, are explicitly looking
also,
at the aesthetics as an art project into finding, you know, what they now call, let's say, investigative aesthetics.
yes,
right?
the forensic
This is the book, and I can highly recommend it to everyone here because it kind of builds the bridges between the two worlds we're discussing here, between those evil social media and people's practices.
So I missed you. I was trying to find the work that I would recommend, that it's about the bombs and how they modeled the mines and everything, that it's not forensic architecture, but it's kind of same procedure, that I think that it's one of the pedagogies of our new digital literacy.
Yeah, because
Adam Harvey.
Okay.
At least the name. But I cannot remember the name of the projects with the Syrian archive, that it's amazing.
Yeah, so far we've you know, been focusing on protocols and meta tags, inventory lists, and other more traditional archives. But yeah, of course, today we have very, very sophisticated software tools, AI and other tools to search through all these data. I want to close with this. Do you want to say anything about this move, maybe from the meta tag to the software tools? Is that just a trend, or
sorry?
Is that something?
The project is the V-Frame project that I think could be used as a model for counter meta tagging, tagging the giant archive, and it's amazing. I think that it's a very good example.
Thank you, Lozana.
Just in closing, I think since we mentioned the Syrian archive, I think it will be a missed opportunity if we don't mention what is going on right at this very moment, since the last few weeks, with the archival efforts of, I call it Sucho, but it's the Initiative to Preserve Ukrainian Cultural Heritage, which is led by a group of people from different backgrounds, including libraries and archives from the States. But yeah, I don't know, if I don't want to overemphasize this, but there is also a Rhizome link there, right? So the key software that is being used right now, and I think it really goes exactly in this direction of the move towards software tools, are the web archiving products that were designed and developed, kind of incubated within Rhizome during my own PhD. So Ilya Kramer right now, together with, of course, other colleagues from the Internet Archive, are really leading this initiative. And while I don't want to give it just yet as an absolute example of decolonial archiving, I do think they are really working towards this direction. I have spoken to various people involved with this initiative. In just like 2 weeks, they set up a Slack channel with like over 1,000 people, and everyone is very, very actively discussing the question of openness, right? Should this data be open? Should it be closed? And maybe as someone who myself, I'm Eastern European too, I want to raise this issue that even I have this prejudice of thinking like, oh my God, everyone in Eastern Europe is only looking at like primarily Facebook, which is the worst, by the way, and a little bit of, you know, also other platforms like Telegram and WhatsApp, etc. But I have to say, looking at this effort with Sucho and the Ukrainian archive, I mean, it's absolutely incredible. You know, it is really not just social media. And this is a country that we would happily, you know, kind of clump together with the global South and like the poor Eastern European corrupt countries. Oh, they only have like brainwashing Facebook there. I mean, no. I mean, yes, on one degree, it is a serious problem. We all, I am working, you know, on the ground there with local friends in Eastern Europe to try to do something about this fake news propaganda right now, very dangerous with Russian trolls everywhere in the Eastern Bloc countries, in Facebook, etc. But I also am really, really impressed by the incredible richness of the digital space of Ukraine that is right now collected through these web archiving tools, and the very, very open conversations from day one within everyone involved in this initiative around decolonization. You know, okay, this is an initiative started by a bunch of people in like the so-called West. So how are they engaging with people on the ground, discussing with them every day, you know, how should the data be preserved? How should it be taken care of? How should it be tagged and curated in the Internet Archive or not, right? Not everything goes into Internet Archive. So I just really wanted to share this with everyone. Please, if you have time and want to get involved, it is really a fantastic initiative. It is dedicated to Ukraine, but I think it's setting an amazing precedent for, you know, the future of how we can think about archiving, kind of cultural heritage more globally, and hopefully it can be transferred also as a model to other kind of countries and other concepts. So I can put it in the chat, in the Etherpad also, the link to the initiative. Yeah, thanks.
Yes.
Sorry, can you say again who took the initiative for this project? I kind of missed it.
So I think the very, very first person who started it is Quinn Dubrovsky from Stanford Library, a specialist in Eastern European Slavic studies, but also a librarian. And the lead developer behind this is Ilya Kramer, who used to work also in Rhizome and has significant contribution to the digital preservation works in Rhizome as well. And I will put the link in the Etherpad right now.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Lozana. I want to thank all of you here and Lima for hosting this. We ended here with the urgencies of the war, and strangely enough, a lot of in the war efforts, are somehow digital, and we will very, very likely hear much more about it. Also, not on the side of investigative aesthetics, but also the cultural heritage side. So thanks a lot, Lozana, for bringing that up, and thanks a lot, everybody. I want to give the word now to Sanneke, and thank you all for participating.
Yeah, so I'll just end by adding thanks. Thank you all for sharing all the amazing work you do with us, and I hope we can continue this conversation and can continue sharing practices, resources, and knowledge for many years to come. We will be back with another symposium next year, but I hope we'll be in touch along the year about all this, and all the maybe now even more urgent than ever topics that it raises. So it's also kind of eerie that something becomes even more relevant nowadays than at the time when we envisioned how we envisioned it when the time we were like organizing this. But I think this was wonderful, and I want to also thank everyone who joined online. I hope to see you all around online and on site in the upcoming period. And also a big thanks to the Lima team who was working so hard behind the scenes to make this happen. So Maya, Luc, Stefan, Susanna, everyone around was invisible but unmissable over this last 2 days. Thank you so much. See you whenever, wherever, and thanks so much.